The rain fell in heavy sheets across the Texas prairie, turning the parched summer earth into a sea of mud. Ezra Sullivan stood knee-deep in a hole he'd been digging since sunrise, his clothes soaked through his weathered hands raw from gripping the shovel. The grave wasn't particularly large, just big enough for old Buck the cattle dog, who'd been at his side for 13 years. Buck had been the last living creature who remembered Ruth, the last pair of eyes that had seen her move about the kitchen, singing softly as she kneaded bread dough. The last witness to the life Ezra had once had before the fever took her 5 years ago. Now there was truly no one left. Ezra paused, leaning on his shovel. The rain plastered his gray hair to his forehead. At 50, his body still held the strength of his younger years, but his spirit felt as hollow as a dried gourd. He looked down at Buck's body wrapped carefully in Ruth's old quilt, something she would have approved of, he was certain. "Almost done, old friend?" He murmured the words swallowed by a crack of thunder. He was about to resume digging when something caught his eye movement on the horizon beyond the fence line that marked the eastern boundary of his property. Ezra squinted through the downpour. Two small figures materialized from the curtain of rain, moving slowly across the expanse of soggy grassland. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in stark white light. A child, Ezra realized, dragging something behind. The image vanished as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed again by the gloom. Ezra's hand instinctively moved to his hip, where his Colt revolver usually hung, but he'd left it in the house not expecting visitors on such a miserable day, and certainly not while burying his dog. "Ruth," he whispered to the wife 5 years gone, "seems you're sending me more than one soul to bury today." He climbed out of the half-dug grave and waited as the figures drew closer. Through the rain, he could now make out a boy no more than 10 or 11, painfully thin, struggling to pull what appeared to be a crude travois, two long branches lashed together with cloth. On it lay a smaller form, ominously still, beneath a sodden blanket. The boy's face came into focus, gaunt cheeks streaked with a mixture of mud and tears, eyes hollowed by a grief too profound for his years. When he saw Ezra, he stopped swaying slightly on his feet, his small hands still gripping the rope he'd been using to pull his burden. "Are you Dr. Sullivan?" the boy called out, his voice cracking with exhaustion. The question hit Ezra like a physical blow. No one in these parts knew him as Dr. Sullivan. He'd left that title behind in Virginia, buried it alongside the bodies of soldiers he couldn't save, abandoned it completely when he couldn't even save his own wife. "Who's asking?" Ezra responded, approaching cautiously. "My name's Caleb Morgan," the boy said, his shoulders heaving with each breath. "My mama said to find Dr. Sullivan. Said you could save anybody." Ezra's stomach twisted. "Your mama's mistaken son. I haven't been a doctor in a long time." The boy's pale blue eyes flashed with desperate anger. "She said it had to be you. Nobody else." With trembling hands, Caleb pulled back the blanket covering the travois. A young girl lay there, perhaps 7 years old, her face waxy and still dark hair plastered to her forehead. Even from several feet away, Ezra could see the telltale bluish tint to her lips. "Please," Caleb begged, "can you save my sister?" Ezra knelt beside the travois, years of medical training overtaking his reluctance. He placed 2 fingers against the child's neck, feeling for a pulse he already knew wouldn't be there. Her skin was cool to the touch, but not completely cold. Death had come recently, perhaps only hours ago. "What's her name?" Ezra asked softly. "Hannah," Caleb whispered, his voice breaking. "Her name's Hannah." Ezra gently closed the girl's eyes, which had been staring sightlessly at the weeping sky. "I'm sorry, son. Hannah's gone." "No!" Caleb shouted, pushing Ezra's hands away. "You're lying. Mama said you could save anyone. You're Dr. Sullivan, the miracle doctor." "Where is your mother now?" Ezra asked, rising to his feet. "Hiding in the old Carter cabin about 5 miles east." Caleb said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She's hurt bad. Men came, shot Pa dead, shot Mama too. She told me to get Hannah to you." The boy's legs finally gave out and he collapsed to his knees in the mud beside his sister's body. I tried to hurry, he sobbed. I tried so hard, but Hannah got so sick. The fever came fast. By morning, she wouldn't wake up. Rain streamed down Ezra's face, mingling with unwelcome tears. He hadn't cried since Ruth died, had thought himself beyond such weakness. Yet here it was breaking through the carefully constructed dam of his isolation. Caleb, he said gently, who told your mother about me? The boy looked up, confusion momentarily replacing grief. She knew you from the war, said she was your nurse in Virginia. He paused, searching Ezra's face. Sarah Morgan. That's my mama's name. The name hit Ezra like a physical blow. Sarah Morgan. Of course, the young nurse who'd stood by him during the worst days of the war, who'd defended him when everything went wrong. Your mother, Ezra said slowly, she's hurt. Shot. Caleb nodded miserably. In the shoulder. It was bleeding real bad. She wrapped it herself, but this morning she couldn't stand upright. Her eyes looked all glassy like Hannah's did before. He couldn't finish the sentence. Ezra looked from the pall to the half-dug grave where Buck lay waiting, then back to the still form of Hannah. The rain showed no sign of letting up. Night would be falling soon. We need to see to your sister first, he said, decision made. Then we'll go help your mother. You'll save Mama. Hope flickered in Caleb's exhausted eyes. Ezra wouldn't make promises he couldn't keep. I'll do what I can. He gently lifted Hannah's body from the travois. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, a bird fallen from its nest. Her dark hair reminded him of Ruth's, the same soft waves. Come with me, he told Caleb, carrying Hannah toward the house. We'll get you dry, get some food in you, then we'll see to your sister. The boy followed, stumbling in Ezra's footsteps, too exhausted to argue. The old farmhouse loomed ahead, its weathered clapboards gray in the rain. A two-story structure with a wide porch that wrapped around three sides, it had once been a place of warmth and promise. Now it stood as a monument to everything Ezra had lost. Inside, Ezra laid Hannah's body on the kitchen table, the same table where he'd failed to save Ruth. He lit the lamps against the gloom and stoked the fire in the cook stove. The heat began to push back the damp chill of the rain. Sit, he instructed Caleb, pointing to a chair by the fire. The boy obeyed mechanically, his eyes never leaving his sister's still form. Ezra found a clean towel and began to gently wipe the mud from Hannah's face. In death, she looked peaceful, as if merely sleeping. Her features were delicate, nothing like Caleb's. She wore a simple cotton dress, now mud-stained and torn, and clutched in her small hand was a handkerchief embroidered with a hummingbird. As he cleaned away the dirt, Ezra examined her more carefully. No obvious injuries, no bruising to suggest violence. Her fingernails were clean, her hair had been recently combed. Someone, her mother, most likely had taken good care of this child until very recently. What happened to her? Ezra asked, his voice softer than before. Caleb stared into the fire, his voice monotone with exhaustion. The fever came 2 days ago. We were hiding in the woods after the men shot Pa and Mama. Hannah said she was cold even though it was so hot. By night she was burning up. Mama couldn't do nothing but hold her. Yesterday morning she just stopped breathing. Ezra swallowed hard. Most likely pneumonia brought on by exposure and weakened resistance. A simple illness that could have been treated with proper care, proper medicine. As he finished cleaning Hannah's face, his fingers found something unusual, a small folded paper sewn into the lining of her dress collar. Carefully he extracted it, opening it to reveal a name and address in San Antonio, along with a hastily scrawled note, "With love, your mother." "Caleb," Ezra said, showing him the paper. "Do you know about this?" The boy glanced at it, then looked away. "That's Uncle James, Mama's brother. She said if anything happened to her and Pa, we should go to him." Ezra nodded and tucked the paper into his pocket. He would keep it safe for when they retrieved Sarah. "I need to prepare your sister," he said gently. Would you like to help, or would you rather wait by the fire? I'll help, Caleb said immediately, rising on unsteady legs. She's my responsibility. Together they washed Hannah's body and dressed her in one of Ruth's old nightgowns, far too big for the child, but the cleanest garment Ezra had available. Caleb remained stoic throughout, his hands trembling, but determined as he helped comb his sister's hair. When they finished, Ezra brought down the small wooden coffin he'd built years ago during the cholera epidemic. It had remained unused in the barn gathering dust. It was meant for a child the right size for Hannah. Did you make this for her? Caleb asked, running his hand over the smooth pine. No, Ezra admitted. I made it long ago, hoping it would never be needed. He didn't mention that he'd built it after Ruth miscarried their only child, a daughter who never drew breath. The rain had eased slightly when they carried the coffin outside. Ezra decided to bury Hannah beside Buck's half-finished grave up on the small hill where Ruth lay. It seemed fitting somehow that they should all be together. The ground was softer now after the rain, and the digging went faster. Caleb insisted on helping, his small hands gripping a garden spade, removing what earth he could despite his exhaustion. They worked in silence as the day faded toward evening, the only sounds the scrape of their tools against the soil and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. When the grave was ready, Ezra gently lowered Hannah's coffin into the earth with ropes. Caleb stood beside him, clutching the embroidered handkerchief he'd taken from his sister's hand. Would you like to say something? Ezra asked. Caleb nodded, his face solemn in the fading light. Goodbye, Hannah, he said, his voice barely audible above the patter of rain. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry about Pa, but I'm going to take care of Mama, I promise. He placed the handkerchief on top of the coffin, then stepped back. She always liked hummingbirds, he explained. Said they were brave because they're so small but can fly so far. Ezra said a simple prayer over both graves, Hannah's and Buck's. Then they filled them in together, the fresh earth dark against the yellow prairie grass. Caleb gathered a handful of wildflowers that had somehow survived both drought and rain, arranging them carefully on his sister's grave. As they walked back to the house, Ezra noticed Caleb limping slightly, favoring his right side. Are you hurt? He asked. It's nothing, the boy said quickly, too quickly. Before Caleb could protest, Ezra knelt and lifted the boy's sodden shirt. A crude bandage, now filthy with mud and blood, was wrapped around his torso. Ezra carefully peeled it back to reveal an angry red wound just below Caleb's ribs, a bullet graze partially healed, but showing signs of infection. You were shot too. Ezra said not a question, but a statement. Caleb looked away. One of the men grabbed me. Pa tried to stop him. That's when they shot Pa. I got away, but he trailed off, the memory too painful to voice. Why didn't you tell me? Ezra asked, anger and concern battling in his voice. Hannah needed help more, Caleb said simply. And then Mama. In that moment, Ezra saw something in Caleb's eyes that he recognized, the same stubborn determination, the same willingness to ignore his own pain that he'd seen in so many soldiers, in himself. Let's get inside, he said gruffly. I need to clean that wound. Back in the house, Ezra heated water and retrieved his medical bag from the back of the closet where it had sat untouched for 5 years. The leather was cracked, the brass clasps tarnished, but the instruments inside were still in good condition, preserved in oil, as Ruth had insisted. Your mother, Ezra said as he cleaned Caleb's wound. How bad was her injury? Caleb winced as Ezra applied carbolic acid to the inflamed skin. The bullet went through her shoulder. She said it didn't hit anything important, but it wouldn't stop bleeding at first. Yesterday she was real hot, like Hannah, and her eyes looked funny. Infection then, possibly septicemia. Ezra's jaw tightened. If Sarah had been shot more than 2 days ago and was already feverish, there might not be much he could do. How many men attacked you? He asked, wrapping a clean bandage around Caleb's torso. 5, Caleb said, led by a man named Victor Blackwood. He wanted our land, said there was gold on it. Ezra's hand stilled. Victor Blackwood. Caleb nodded. You know him. Ezra resumed his work tying off the bandage. The name sounds familiar. That was a lie. He knew exactly who Victor Blackwood was, a ghost from his past he'd hoped never to encounter again. When he finished tending to Caleb's wound, Ezra fed the boy a simple meal of beans and cornbread. Caleb ate ravenously at first, then more slowly as exhaustion overtook hunger. By the time he'd emptied his plate, he was fighting to keep his eyes open. Rest, Ezra told him, guiding him to the small bedroom that had once been meant for the child he and Ruth never had. We'll leave at first light to find your mother. Promise, Caleb mumbled, already half asleep. I promise, Ezra said, though he knew better than to make promises in matters of life and death. After Caleb fell asleep, Ezra returned to his medical bag, taking inventory of what remained. Laudanum quinine carbolic acid catgut for sutures, basic surgical instruments, not much but perhaps enough. He added bandages, clean cloths, and a flask of whiskey for sterilization and for courage. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a world washed clean. The night air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and sage. Ezra stepped onto the porch, his eyes drawn to the two fresh graves on the hillside just visible in the moonlight that now broke through scattered clouds. Ruth, he whispered into the night, what am I supposed to do? I couldn't save you. What makes anyone think I can save Sarah? Only the chirp of crickets answered him. Ezra sighed heavily and returned inside to prepare for the journey ahead. He cleaned his revolver and loaded it carefully. Victor Blackwood's presence changed everything. This wasn't just about rescuing Sarah anymore. It was about confronting a past he'd tried desperately to forget. Sleep eluded him that night. Instead, Ezra sat in his rocking chair by the window, watching over Caleb and thinking about Sarah Morgan. She'd been so young during the war, barely 20, when she'd been assigned to his field hospital. Intelligent, competent with a calmness that steadied even the most panicked soldiers. She'd stood by him through the worst of it, even when... Ezra shook his head, forcing the memories away. That was then. This was now. He had a wounded woman to save and a boy who'd already lost too much. As dawn broke over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Ezra roused Caleb gently. Time to go find your mother, he said. The boy was instantly awake, pushing aside the lingering effects of exhaustion. You'll need your doctor things, he said, eyeing the medical bag Ezra had packed. I've got them, Ezra assured him, and food, water, bandages. Everything we might need. They ate a quick breakfast, then Ezra saddled his two horses. Thunder, his own sturdy gelding, and Willow, the gentle mare that had once been Ruth's. Caleb was too small for Thunder, but he fit well on Willow's back, though he winced as the movement pulled at his injured side. The old Carter cabin, Ezra confirmed as they mounted. You know how to get there. Caleb nodded. 5 miles east near the creek that runs through the cottonwoods. I know it, Ezra said. The abandoned homestead had been empty for years, ever since the Carters had given up trying to make a living from the unforgiving land and moved back east. They set out as the sun cleared the horizon, casting long shadows across the rain-soaked prairie. The storm had transformed the landscape overnight, bringing temporary life to the drought-stricken land. Wildflowers that had been dormant for months now dotted the grassland, with splashes of yellow, purple, and white. Caleb rode slightly ahead, his small back straight, despite his injury, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The boy had a watchfulness about him that spoke of lessons learned too young, the wariness of someone who knew that danger could come at any moment. About an hour into their journey, dark clouds began to gather again, and the distant rumble of thunder warned of another approaching storm. We should find shelter until it passes, Ezra called to Caleb, eyeing the threatening sky. The boy pointed to a rock formation ahead, where an overhanging ledge would provide some protection. They urged their horses forward, reaching the shelter just as the first heavy drops began to fall. Dismounting, they led the horses under the rocky overhang and settled in to wait out the storm. Caleb sat with his back against the stone wall, clutching Hannah's embroidered handkerchief, his expression distant. She made this herself, he said, after a long silence, his fingers tracing the delicate stitches of the hummingbird. Mama taught her, said Hannah had the patience for fine work. Ezra nodded, giving the boy space to talk about his sister if he needed to. Why'd you stop being a doctor? Caleb asked suddenly, his blue eyes piercing in their directness. Ezra sighed, debating how much to tell the child. Sometimes, he said carefully, we can't save the people we most want to save, and sometimes that makes it hard to keep trying to save others. You lost someone, Caleb said, not a question, but an observation. My wife Ruth, Ezra confirmed. 5 years ago, fever took her. But you were a doctor, Caleb pressed. Shouldn't you have been able to save her? The innocent question reopened the wound that had never truly healed. Being a doctor doesn't make you God's son, Ezra said more harshly than he'd intended. We all have our limits. Caleb was quiet for a moment, then said softly, I couldn't save Hannah. Or Pa, I tried, but I couldn't. The raw guilt in the boy's voice struck a chord in Ezra's heart. Here was a child carrying the same burden that had nearly crushed him, the weight of perceived failure of lives he couldn't save. That wasn't your responsibility, Ezra said gently. You're a child. No one expects you to save lives. But I'm the oldest, Caleb insisted. Pa always said it was my job to look after Hannah, and I promised Mama I'd get help. Ezra moved closer to the boy, placing a hand on his thin shoulder. Sometimes we cannot save the people we love, he said, echoing his earlier words. But that doesn't mean we stop trying to save others. Your mother needs you now. That's where you focus. Caleb nodded slowly, tucking the handkerchief carefully into his pocket. Is that why you're helping us to save someone else, since you couldn't save your wife? The question was disarmingly perceptive. Maybe, Ezra admitted, or maybe I'm just tired of being alone with my ghosts. They fell into silence as the storm intensified, rain lashing the ground beyond their shelter, thunder cracking overhead. Ezra noticed Caleb shivering slightly, whether from cold or lingering fever from his wound, he couldn't tell. Here, he said, removing his coat and draping it around the boy's shoulders. Can't have you catching a chill. I'm not cold, Caleb protested, but he pulled the coat tighter around himself nonetheless. Tell me about your mother, Ezra said, partly to distract the boy, partly because he genuinely wanted to know what had become of Sarah Morgan after the war. A small smile touched Caleb's lips, the first Ezra had seen. She's the strongest person I know. She can shoot better than Pa could. Don't tell him I said that. He added quickly, then his face fell as he remembered his father was beyond hearing such betrayals. She reads to us every night, he continued after a moment, even when she's tired from working all day. She knows all sorts of things about plants that heal and animals and stars. It sounded like the Sarah that Ezra remembered, intelligent, capable with an insatiable curiosity about the world. How did she meet your father? Ezra asked. After the war, Caleb said. She was nursing at a hospital in St. Louis. Pa had been a soldier too, but not in your unit. His leg was all shot up. She helped him walk again, and they got married when he healed. The story had a familiar ring to it. Many nurses had married former patients after the war. It was a common enough tale. They came to Texas 3 years ago, Caleb continued. Pa said there was opportunity here, room to build something of our own. His voice caught. He was just starting to make the farm work when Blackwood came. Ezra's jaw tightened at the name, Victor Blackwood. The memory of their last encounter was like a physical pain, the accusations, the rage in the man's eyes, the threats. Your father, Ezra said carefully, did he know Blackwood before? Was there some prior dispute? Caleb shook his head. No, sir. Blackwood just showed up one day, said our land had gold on it, offered to buy it. When Pa refused, he got mean. Said we'd regret it. The boy's hands clenched into fists. 3 days later, they came at night. 5 men. They shot Pa when he went to the door. Shot Mama when she tried to help him. And you and Hannah, Ezra prompted gently. We were supposed to be asleep, but I heard the shouting. I got Hannah and we hid under the house in the crawl space. One of the men found us, dragged me out. Caleb's hand went unconsciously to his wounded side. That's when he shot me. Pa wasn't quite dead yet. He jumped, the man told us to run. They shot him again right in front of me. The boy's voice had gone flat, emotionless, as if he were describing something that had happened to someone else. Ezra recognized the detachment as a form of self-protection. He'd seen it in soldiers who'd witnessed too much horror. You got away, Ezra said, encouraging him to continue. Caleb nodded. Mama was hurt, but she could still walk. We ran into the woods behind our place, hid there for a day until we were sure they were gone. Mama knew about the old Carter cabin, said we'd be safe there for a while. The rain began to ease, the thunder moving off to the east. Ezra checked the sky, judging they had perhaps an hour before the next wave of storms arrived. We should keep moving, he said, standing and stretching his stiff legs. Your mother's waited long enough. They mounted up and continued eastward, the ground muddy beneath their horses' hooves. The landscape changed gradually as they rode the open prairie, giving way to scattered stands of cottonwood and mesquite. Birds called from the trees, and twice they startled deer from thickets of brush. By midday, they reached the creek Caleb had mentioned, swollen now, with rainwater rushing over its banks in some places. They followed it downstream, the horses picking their way carefully along the slippery bank. There, Caleb said, suddenly pointing ahead to a small clearing where a dilapidated cabin stood, its roof partially collapsed, the windows dark, empty sockets. Ezra reined in, thunder studying the cabin and the surrounding area. Something didn't feel right. There was no smoke from the chimney, no sign of recent activity around the building. Wait here, he told Caleb, drawing his revolver. Let me check first. But Mama, Caleb began to protest. If there's trouble, you ride back to my place. Ezra cut him off. Understand, don't try to help, just ride. Reluctantly, Caleb nodded. Ezra approached the cabin, cautiously alert for any movement or sound. The door hung askew on broken hinges, revealing a gloomy interior. He paused at the threshold, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. Sarah, he called softly. Sarah Morgan. A weak moan came from the far corner of the single room. Ezra moved quickly toward the sound, holstering his revolver. A figure lay on a makeshift pallet of blankets, barely visible in the gloom. Sarah, he breathed, kneeling beside her. Her face was flushed with fever, her dark hair matted with sweat. The crude bandage around her left shoulder was soaked through with blood and pus. But it was her Sarah Morgan, the nurse who'd stood by him through the darkest days of the war. Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice, unfocused at first, then widening in recognition. Ezra, she whispered, her voice cracked and dry. You came. Caleb found me, he said, gently lifting the edge of her bandage to examine the wound beneath. It was badly infected, the skin around it angry and swollen. I'm going to help you, but we need to move you. This place isn't safe. I am. Hannah, Sarah murmured, trying to sit up. Where's Hannah? Ezra gently pressed her back down. Rest. Caleb's outside. I'll get him. He stepped back to the doorway and signaled to Caleb, who immediately urged Willow forward at a trot. Mama, the boy cried, dismounting before the horse had fully stopped and rushing to Sarah's side. My boy, Sarah smiled weakly, raising a trembling hand to touch his face. You're safe. Caleb knelt beside her, taking her hand. Mama, this is Dr. Sullivan. He's going to make you better. Sarah's eyes found Ezra's, a question in them. Hannah, she asked again. Caleb's face crumpled. She's gone, Mama. The fever took her yesterday morning. Sarah closed her eyes, tears slipping down her feverish cheeks. My little girl, she whispered. My brave little girl. Ezra moved to check her pulse, rapid and thready. Her skin burned with fever. Sarah, we need to move you to my place. I can treat you better there. She nodded weakly. Victor, she managed. He'll be looking. I know, Ezra said grimly. We'll be careful. With Caleb's help, he fashioned a travois similar to the one the boy had used for Hannah, attaching it to Thunder's saddle. They carefully moved Sarah onto it, covering her with blankets against the increasingly cool air. It'll be a rough ride, Ezra warned her, but we don't have much choice. I've endured worse, Sarah said, attempting a smile that turned into a grimace of pain. As they prepared to leave, Ezra noticed a small bundle of Sarah's belongings in the corner of the cabin. He gathered them up, finding a well-worn Bible, a small pouch that clinked with coins, and a folded piece of paper that appeared to be a deed to the Morgan homestead. We should take these, he told Caleb, tucking the items into his saddlebag. The boy nodded, his expression grim. Blackwood wanted our deed, said he'd make us sell. Ezra's jaw tightened. Of course Blackwood would want documentation. The man had always been meticulous about covering his tracks. They set out as the first drops of the next storm began to fall, Ezra leading Thunder with Sarah on the travois, Caleb following on Willow. Progress was slow. Ezra kept their pace gentle to avoid jostling Sarah unnecessarily, and the rain soon soaked through their clothes again. Halfway back to the ranch, Sarah began to mumble incoherently, her fever spiking dangerously high. Ezra called a halt beneath a stand of trees that offered minimal shelter and knelt beside her, administering a dose of quinine from his medical bag. Is she dying? Caleb asked, his voice small and frightened. Ezra looked at the boy, seeing the terror in his eyes. He'd already lost his father and sister. The thought of losing his mother, too, was more than any child should have to bear. Not if I can help it, Ezra said with more confidence than he felt. Your mother is strong. She's fighting. In her delirium, Sarah clutched at Ezra's arm, her eyes opening but not truly seeing. Victor, she rasped. Not your fault. They switched the medicine. He knows. Ezra froze, the words hitting him like physical blows. Sarah, he said urgently, what about the medicine? What does Victor know? But she had slipped back into unconsciousness, her breathing shallow and rapid. What was she talking about? Caleb asked, confusion written across his face. Fever dreams, Ezra said dismissively, though his mind was racing. We need to keep moving. Storm's getting worse. They continued through the driving rain, the travois sliding in the mud, making the journey even more difficult. By the time the ranch house came into sight, dusk was falling, and Sarah's condition had deteriorated further. Get the door, Ezra instructed Caleb as they approached the house. The boy hurried ahead, pushing open the door and lighting lamps, while Ezra carefully lifted Sarah from the travois. She felt light in his arms, diminished by fever and blood loss. He carried her into the house to the same bedroom where Ruth had died. The irony wasn't lost on him. Another woman he might fail to save in the same bed where his wife had slipped away despite his desperate efforts. Boil water, he told Caleb, laying Sarah gently on the bed, as much as you can, and bring clean towels from the chest in the hallway. While Caleb hurried to follow his instructions, Ezra opened his medical bag, taking out instruments, carbolic acid catgut for sutures. He'd need to clean the wound thoroughly, drain the infection, possibly debride dead tissue. It had been 5 years since he'd performed any kind of surgery. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged his instruments. Don't fail this time, he muttered to himself. Not again. Caleb returned with towels and the first pot of boiling water. What can I do to help? He asked, his young face set with determination. Ezra considered sending the boy away. A child shouldn't have to witness what was to come, but he needed an extra pair of hands, and Caleb had already seen more horror than most adults. I need to clean and treat your mother's wound, he explained. It will be painful for her even in her current state. I need you to hold her still when I tell you to, and to hand me things when I ask. Can you do that? Caleb nodded solemnly. Yes, sir. Ezra cut away Sarah's blood-soaked dress and the bandage beneath, revealing the full extent of the wound. The bullet had indeed passed through her shoulder, entering from the front and exiting through her back, but it had torn muscle and possibly nicked bone in its passage. The wound was grossly infected with purulent drainage and surrounding tissues an angry red. Hold her shoulders, Ezra instructed Caleb, positioning the boy at the head of the bed. I'm going to clean this, and it will hurt. She might thrash. Caleb placed his small hands on his mother's shoulders, his face pale, but resolute. Ezra began the grim work of debridement, removing dead tissue and draining the infection. Despite her weakened state, Sarah moaned and writhed as he worked her body, reacting to the pain, even as her mind remained locked in a fevered delirium. It's all right, Mama, Caleb soothed, his voice breaking. Dr. Sullivan is helping you. You're going to be all right. Ezra worked methodically, his earlier tremors forgotten as muscle memory took over. This was what he had been trained to do, what he had done countless times during the war. The familiar rhythm of surgical procedure calmed him, focused him. This at least he knew. As he irrigated the wound with carbolic solution, Sarah's eyes flew open, suddenly lucid. Ezra, she gasped. Hannah, is she really? I'm sorry, Sarah, he said, gently continuing his work. She's gone. We buried her yesterday. A sob escaped her lips, quickly turning into a cough that racked her thin frame. My fault, she whispered. Should have protected her better. No, Mama, Caleb insisted, tears streaming down his face. It wasn't your fault. It was Blackwood. He did this. At the name, Sarah's eyes widened further. Victor, she rasped, grabbing Ezra's wrist with surprising strength. He found out about Hannah. He knows she's not. She broke off, her eyes rolling back as the unconsciousness claimed her again. What was she saying? Caleb asked, looking to Ezra in confusion. What does Blackwood know about Hannah? Ezra shook his head. Fever talk, he said, though he suspected there was more to it. Help me turn her so I can check the exit wound. They carefully rolled Sarah onto her side. The exit wound was smaller but equally infected. Ezra repeated the cleaning process, then sutured both wounds, leaving small drainage channels. Will she be okay now? Caleb asked as Ezra applied clean bandages. We've done what we can, Ezra said honestly. The infection is severe. The next day or two will tell. He placed a hand on Sarah's forehead, still burning with fever. She needs medicines to fight the infection, to bring down the fever, and plenty of fluids. I'll help, Caleb said immediately. Tell me what to do. Ezra looked at the boy, exhausted, injured himself, yet still determined to do whatever was needed for his mother. In that moment, he saw something of himself in Caleb, the same stubborn refusal to accept defeat. First, you need to rest, Ezra said firmly. You're no good to your mother if you collapse. I'll watch over her tonight. Tomorrow you can help. Caleb started to protest, but a massive yawn overtook him, undermining his argument. There's a trundle bed in the corner, Ezra said, nodding toward it. You can sleep there if you want to stay close to your mother. The boy nodded gratefully and moved to the small bed, pulling off his muddy boots. He was asleep almost as soon as his head touched the pillow, the events of the past few days finally catching up with him. Ezra settled into the chair beside Sarah's bed, preparing for a long night. Outside, the storm continued to rage, rain lashing against the windows, wind howling around the eaves of the old house. It matched his inner turmoil. Sarah Morgan, after all these years, the last person he'd expected to see again, and yet perhaps the one person who might understand what he'd been through. She knew what had happened with Victor Blackwood during the war, had been there when everything fell apart. And now Blackwood was here in Texas, still causing destruction. The coincidence was too great to ignore. But what had Sarah meant about Hannah? What secret was she keeping? Ezra reached out gently, brushing a strand of damp hair from Sarah's feverish face. Fight, Sarah, he whispered. Your boy needs you. And maybe I do too. As the storm raged outside and the night deepened, Ezra kept his vigil, watching over the woman who had once watched over him and the boy who had somehow breached the walls of his carefully constructed solitude. For the first time in 5 years, Ezra Sullivan felt something stir within his hollow chest, something that might, with care, grow into purpose again. Dawn broke reluctantly over the Sullivan Ranch gray light filtering through rain-streaked windows. Ezra hadn't slept his vigil beside Sarah's bed, unbroken through the long night. Every hour he checked her fever-spooned water between her cracked lips and changed the cool compresses on her forehead. Her breathing remained shallow, her skin still burning with infection, but she had survived the night, a small victory, but one he clung to. In the trundle bed across the room, Caleb slept deeply. His thin body curled protectively around Hannah's embroidered handkerchief. Even in sleep, the boy's face held a wariness beyond his years. Ezra studied him in the dim light, the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the dark circles beneath his eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw. In just days, this child had buried his father and sister, nearly lost his mother, and been thrust into the care of a stranger. Yet somehow he endured. Sarah stirred, a low moan escaping her lips. Ezra leaned forward, pressing his palm to her forehead. Still too hot, but perhaps a degree less than before. Her eyes fluttered open, more lucid than they had been the previous night. "Ezra," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Not a dream, then?" "No, well," he confirmed, helping her take a small sip of water. "Caleb found me just as you told him to." Her gaze moved to her sleeping son, softening with love and sorrow. "Hannah, we buried her properly," Ezra said gently, "on the hill behind my house next to my wife." Tears welled in Sarah's fever-bright eyes. "I couldn't save her. The fever came so fast." "I know," Ezra said, taking her hand. It felt fragile in his, the bones too prominent beneath her skin. "You did everything you could." She turned her face away, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. "Not everything. I should have come to you sooner, but I was afraid you wouldn't help us after what happened." Ezra's jaw tightened. "That was a lifetime ago, Sarah." "Was it?" Her eyes found his again, searching. "You're still punishing yourself. I can see it in your face." Before Ezra could respond, Caleb stirred, sitting up with the immediate alertness of a child accustomed to danger. When he saw his mother awake, he scrambled from the bed, nearly tripping in his haste. "Mama," he cried, rushing to her side. "My brave boy," Sarah whispered, raising a trembling hand to touch his face. "You did it. You found Dr. Sullivan." Caleb nodded, tears threatening. "Are you going to be all right?" Sarah glanced at Ezra, a question in her eyes. "Your mother is fighting a serious infection," Ezra explained to the boy, "but she's strong and the wound is clean now. We'll do everything we can." It wasn't a promise of recovery, but Caleb seemed to take it as one, his thin shoulders relaxing slightly. "I'm going to make some broth," Ezra said, rising from his chair. "Caleb, stay with your mother. Call me if anything changes." In the kitchen, Ezra stoked the fire in the cook stove and set a pot of water to boil, adding dried beef, onions, and the few herbs he kept on hand. As he worked, his mind turned over Sarah's words and the fragments she'd spoken in her delirium the night before. Victor Blackwood. The name alone was enough to send a chill through him. Their history went back to the darkest days of the war. Blackwood had been brought to Ezra's field hospital with a mangled leg, the result of artillery fire. Ezra had tried to save the limb, but gangrene had set in. By the time he'd made the decision to amputate, it was too late. The infection had spread, and though Blackwood survived, he lost his leg and nearly his life. He'd blamed Ezra, accused him of deliberate negligence. There had been an inquiry with Sarah as the only witness to defend him. In the chaos of war, the matter had eventually been dismissed, but Blackwood had sworn revenge. And now somehow their paths had crossed it again in Texas. But what had Sarah meant about Hannah? What secret was she keeping that had brought Blackwood's wrath down on her family? The sound of boots on the porch steps jolted Ezra from his thoughts. He moved swiftly to the window, peering out cautiously. Sheriff Miller from Redemption stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable as the rain dripped from his coat. Ezra opened the door, keeping his expression neutral. "Sheriff." Wasn't expecting visitors in this weather. Dr. Sullivan, Miller nodded, his weathered face grave. Sorry to trouble you, but I've got concerning news. There's been a killing the Morgan family out by Cottonwood Creek. Father dead, mother, and 2 children missing. Signs of a struggle. Ezra's heart raced, but he kept his voice steady. That is concerning. Thing is, Miller continued, a man named Blackwood rode into town yesterday claiming the Morgans stole from him before disappearing. But something about his story don't sit right with me. He paused, studying Ezra's face. You being the closest neighbor to that section, I wondered if you'd seen or heard anything unusual these past few days. Ezra weighed his options carefully. Sheriff Miller was a fair man by reputation, but Ezra had no way of knowing if Blackwood had influence over him. Can't say that I have, Ezra replied. Been keeping to myself as usual. Storms kept me close to home. Miller nodded, seemingly unsurprised by the answer. Well, if you do see anything, woman and 2 young'uns on the run, I'd appreciate hearing about it. Of course, Ezra agreed. Any idea what they supposedly stole? Blackwood says a deed to a gold claim and some family heirloom, a necklace belonged to his sister. Miller shrugged. Like I said, story feels off. Blackwood's got men scouring the area offering rewards. Made it clear they want the woman and children alive. Unusual for thieves to be shown such mercy, Ezra observed. My thinking exactly. Miller replaced his hat. Well, I won't keep you. Just stay alert. Blackwood's men don't look like the type to ask questions before shooting. I'll be careful, Ezra assured him, already planning to double-check that his rifle was loaded and within reach. After the sheriff rode away, Ezra returned to the bedroom, finding Caleb sitting vigil beside his mother, who had drifted back to sleep. Who was that? The boy asked, tension evident in his posture. Sheriff Miller. Ezra answered honestly. Blackwood's in town telling people your family stole from him. He's got men searching the area. Fear flashed across Caleb's face. He'll kill us if he finds us. I won't let that happen, Ezra said firmly, but we need to understand what he's really after. He hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging at him since the previous night. Caleb, is there something I should know about Hannah? Something different? The boy's eyes widened, then darted to his sleeping mother. What do you mean? Last night your mother said something about Blackwood knowing something about Hannah. That she wasn't... Ezra trailed off, unsure how to phrase his suspicion. Caleb's face closed off, his expression becoming guarded. I don't know what you're talking about. He was lying. Ezra could see it in the way the boy avoided his gaze and the sudden stiffness of his shoulders. But before he could press further, a soft voice interrupted. Hannah wasn't Caleb's biological sister. Sarah had awakened, her eyes clearer than before, despite the fever still evident in her flushed cheeks. Mama, you said we weren't supposed to tell anyone, Caleb protested. Ezra needs to know, Sarah said weakly. If he's going to protect us, he needs to understand why Victor wants us so badly. Ezra pulled his chair closer to the bed. Tell me. Mashksartet closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength. Hannah was Victor's niece, his sister Mary's child. Mary died in childbirth 8 years ago. Her husband had abandoned her when he learned she was pregnant and she had nowhere to go. Victor had taken her in, but only out of obligation. He resented her, blamed her for bringing shame to the family name. You knew Mary, Ezra asked. Sarah nodded. We were childhood friends. After the war, when I was nursing in St. Louis, she wrote to me desperate for help. By the time I reached her, she was already in labor. I couldn't save her, but the baby Hannah survived. And you took her, Ezra said, beginning to understand. I couldn't leave her with Victor. He called her a bastard, said she'd brought a curse on their family by killing Mary. Sarah's voice strengthened with anger at the memory. My husband and I had only been married a year. Caleb was just a toddler. But we took Hannah as our own, gave her our name. Victor didn't try to stop you. He was glad to be rid of her, said he never wanted to see her again. Sarah reached for Caleb's hand, squeezing it weakly. We raised Hannah, and as our daughter, never treated her any differently than Caleb. She was ours in every way that mattered. But Blackwood changed his mind, Ezra guessed. After all these years, he wanted her back. Not her, Sarah corrected. What she represented. Mary had inherited property from their parents' valuable land in Missouri with timber rights. As her child, Hannah was the legal heir. Victor had been using the proceeds all these years, claiming Mary had died childless. Understanding dawned on Ezra. Then someone discovered Hannah was alive. Sarah nodded. 3 months ago, a lawyer from Missouri tracked us down. He'd been searching for Mary's child, said there was a substantial inheritance waiting. We didn't know what to do. Hannah had no idea she wasn't our natural daughter. So you decided to claim the inheritance, Ezra said. No, Sarah's voice was firm despite her weakness. We decided to tell Hannah the truth when she was older, let her make her own choice about the inheritance. But somehow Victor found out. He came to our farm, demanded we sign papers stating Hannah had died years ago. And when you refused, he threatened us, said he'd take Hannah, tell her we'd stolen her, kept her from her true family and fortune. Sarah's eyes filled with tears again. We were planning to leave to go to my brother in San Antonio, but before we could, Victor returned with his men. They killed my husband, shot me, burned our home. Caleb, who had been silent during his mother's explanation, suddenly spoke. They were looking for Hannah's birth certificate. Pa hid it along with the lawyer's letter in the place where he kept our deed. And they didn't find it, Ezra asked. Caleb shook his head. Pa's last words to me were to protect it. Said it was Hannah's future. The boy reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. Not the handkerchief as Ezra had assumed, but a document that had been hidden inside it. I sewed it into Hannah's handkerchief before we ran. Figured nobody would look there. Ezra unfolded the paper carefully. It was indeed a birth certificate showing Mary Blackwood as the mother-father unknown, with a letter attached from a law firm in St. Louis explaining Hannah's inheritance, an estate valued at over $20,000, a fortune by any standard. Victor would kill for this, Ezra said grimly, refolding the document. He already has, Sarah whispered. And he won't stop until he has that paper and we're all dead, the only witnesses to his crime. The gravity of the situation settled over them like a physical weight. These weren't simple refugees from violence. They were targets of a deliberate, calculated campaign by a man Ezra knew to be ruthless and vindictive. He doesn't know Hannah's dead, Ezra realized aloud. He's still looking for all three of you. Sarah nodded weakly. If he learns Hannah died, that paper becomes even more dangerous to him. It proves he's been defrauding the estate for years. Ezra tucked the document into his shirt pocket. For now, you both need to rest and recover. I'll keep watch. The storm should keep Blackwood's men at bay, at least for today. He returned to the kitchen to finish preparing the broth, his mind working furiously. The situation was far more complicated and dangerous than he'd initially realized. Blackwood was not only seeking revenge against the Morgans, he was covering up fraud and possibly murder. And if he discovered Ezra was harboring Sarah and Caleb, his old vendetta would resurface with deadly consequence. The broth was ready by mid-morning. Ezra helped Sarah sit up enough to sip it while Caleb ate a proper breakfast at the bedside. The boys seemed relieved to have shared their secret, though wariness still shadowed his eyes. What will happen to Hannah's money now? He asked suddenly. Ezra considered the question. Legally, without a will, Hannah's estate would likely pass to her closest living relatives, which would be your mother as her adoptive parent. So Victor still has reason to come after us. Caleb concluded, his young mind quickly grasping the implications. I'm afraid so, Ezra confirmed. But first we focus on getting your mother well. Then we can decide how to handle Blackwood. As if in response to her son's concerns, Sarah's condition worsened throughout the day. By afternoon, her fever had spiked dangerously high, her breathing becoming labored. Ezra applied cold compresses, administered more quinine, and prayed for the first time in years. Is she dying? Caleb asked, his voice small as he watched Ezra work. Ezra couldn't bring himself to lie to the boy. She's very sick. The infection is fighting back hard. Like with Hannah, Caleb whispered. No, Ezra said firmly. This is different. Your mother is stronger, and we caught it earlier. We have medicines that can help. But as evening approached, Sarah slipped into delirium again, mumbling incoherently, occasionally calling for Hannah or her husband. Ezra sent Caleb to the kitchen to heat more water, partly to give the boy something useful to do, partly to shield him from seeing his mother deteriorate. Alone with Sarah, Ezra took her hand in his. Don't you dare give up, he told her fiercely. That boy needs you. And damn it, Sarah, I think I need you too. You're the only one who knows the truth about what happened with Blackwood. To his surprise, Sarah's eyes opened suddenly clear. Not your fault, she whispered. Victor bribed the hospital steward to switch your medicines. I saw him but couldn't prove it. Ezra felt as if the ground had dropped away beneath him. What are you saying? The gangrene in his leg, it wasn't your mistake. The steward replaced your carbolic acid with water. Her voice was faint but determined. I tried to tell the inquiry, but no one believed me. Just a woman, just a nurse. The revelation struck Ezra like a physical blow. For years, he'd carried the weight of Blackwood's lost leg, the supposed failure that had made him question his abilities as a doctor. That doubt had followed him home from the war, had paralyzed him when Ruth fell ill, had convinced him he was not worthy of his calling. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. I tried after the inquiry, but you'd already closed yourself off. Then the war ended and you disappeared. Sarah's eyes began to lose focus again. I should have tried harder. Maybe then you would have been able to save her your wife. Ruth, Ezra said, the name catching in his throat. Her name was Ruth. I'm sorry, Sarah whispered, slipping back into fever dreams. For everything. Ezra sat motionless, Sarah's revelation echoing in his mind. If what she said was true, and he had no reason to doubt her, then the foundation of his self-imposed exile, his abandonment of medicine, was built on a lie. He hadn't failed Blackwood. He had been sabotaged. And perhaps he hadn't failed Ruth either. Perhaps her death had not been the result of his inadequacy, but simply the cruel randomness of disease, the limitations of medical knowledge, the harsh reality that doctors could not save everyone, no matter their skill or dedication. The thought was simultaneously liberating and devastating. Years of guilt and self-recrimination, possibly for nothing. Caleb returned with the hot water, his young face pinched with worry. Is she worse? Ezra pulled himself back to the present. About the same, but she's strong, Caleb. She's fighting. Through the night, they took turns keeping vigil. Ezra showed Caleb how to change the compresses, how to check his mother's pulse, how to help her take small sips of water. The boy was a quick study, his hands gentle despite their calluses, his attention unwavering. You'd make a good doctor, Ezra observed during one of their changeovers. Caleb looked surprised, then thoughtful. Pa wanted me to be a farmer like him. What do you want? Ezra asked. The boy was silent for a long moment. I don't know anymore, he finally admitted. Everything's different now. Ezra nodded in understanding. It's all right not to know. You have time. By dawn, Sarah's fever had broken. Ezra changed her bandages, finding the wounds less inflamed, the drainage clearer. She slept more peacefully now, her breathing deeper and more regular. She's going to be all right, isn't she? Caleb asked, hope creeping into his voice for the first time. I believe so, Ezra said, allowing himself to share in the boy's optimism. She's through the worst of it. Now she needs rest and nourishment to regain her strength. Relief washed over Caleb's face quickly, followed by exhaustion. The boy had pushed himself to his limits, keeping watch through the night despite his own injury and emotional trauma. You should rest, Ezra told him. Your mother's going to need you strong when she wakes. To his surprise, Caleb didn't argue, simply nodded and curled up on the trundle bed, asleep almost instantly. Ezra moved to the window, pushing aside the curtain to check the weather. The rain had finally stopped, and weak sunshine filtered through breaking clouds. The world outside looked washed clean, the prairie grass vibrant green where days before it had been brown and brittle. The change in weather brought new concerns. With clear skies, Blackwood's men would intensify their search. The Sullivan Ranch, isolated as it was, would eventually draw their attention. Ezra checked his rifle and revolver, making sure both were loaded and readily accessible. Then he made a pot of coffee and settled at the kitchen table with the birth certificate and lawyer's letter, studying them carefully. The document confirmed everything Sarah had told him. Hannah was indeed Mary Blackwood's daughter, born in St. Louis 8 years ago. The lawyer's letter, dated 3 months prior, explained that Mary's estate had been held in trust with Victor acting as executor. However, questions had arisen about Victor's management of the assets, leading to a search for any heirs Mary might have left behind. If Victor had been embezzling from the estate, as seemed likely, Hannah's existence threatened not only his financial security, but possibly his freedom. With Hannah dead, the threat remained as long as the documentation existed, and as long as Sarah and Caleb could testify to Hannah's identity. Ezra was so absorbed in these thoughts that he almost missed the sound of approaching horses. Almost, but not quite. Years of solitary living had sharpened his senses to any disturbance of the usual silence. Moving quickly to the window, he saw 3 riders approaching from the east, rough-looking men armed with the purposeful air of hunters who had spotted their prey. Blackwood's men, without a doubt. Ezra's first instinct was to grab his rifle to stand his ground and protect those under his roof. But 3 against 1 were poor odds, especially with Sarah too weak to move and Caleb to protect. Instead, he moved swiftly to the bedroom, waking Caleb with a gentle hand over his mouth to prevent any startled creak. "Riders coming," he whispered. "Blackwood's men, I think. We need to hide you and your mother." Fear flashed in the boy's eyes, but he nodded in understanding, immediately alert. Ezra had prepared for this possibility. Behind the pantry and the kitchen, a trap door led to a small root cellar, just large enough for 2 people to hide comfortably. "Help me with your mother," he instructed Caleb. Together they carefully lifted Sarah, who stirred but didn't fully wake. Ezra carried her to the kitchen and down the narrow steps into the root cellar, laying her on a pallet he'd prepared earlier. Caleb followed, clutching Hannah's handkerchief and birth certificate, which Ezra had returned to him for safekeeping. "Stay quiet no matter what you hear," Ezra told him, handing him a canteen of water and a loaded pistol. "Use this only if someone other than me opens that door. Understand?" Caleb nodded, his face pale but determined. "What will you tell them?" "That I haven't seen anyone," Ezra said. "That I've been alone as always." "What if they don't believe you?" Ezra had no reassuring answer for that. "Just stay hidden. I'll handle it." He closed the trap door, sliding the pantry shelf back over it, just as a heavy knock sounded at the front door. Taking a deep breath, Ezra composed his features into the unfriendly scowl that had kept unwanted visitors at bay for years. He opened the door to find 3 men on his porch, unshaven, trail-worn, with the hard eyes of men accustomed to violence. The leader, a tall man with a scar running from temple to jaw, stepped forward. "Sullivan Bow," he asked, his tone making it clear it wasn't really a question. "What do you want?" Ezra replied, making no move to invite them in. "Looking for fugitives," the scarred man said. "Woman and 2 children. Thieves and murderers. Thought they might have passed this way." "Haven't seen anyone," Ezra said flatly. "Storms kept me busy enough without entertaining visitors." The man's eyes narrowed, unconvinced. "Mind if we take a look around? Mr. Blackwood's offering a substantial reward." "I mind very much," Ezra said, his hand moving casually to rest near his holstered revolver. "This is private property." The scarred man smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Now that's not very neighborly. Almost makes a man think you've got something to hide." "What I've got is a dislike for trespassers," Ezra countered. "Sheriff Miller was here yesterday asking the same questions. I told him what I'm telling you. I haven't seen anyone." The mention of the sheriff gave the men pause. They exchanged glances, clearly recalculating their approach. The sheriff, huh, the scarred man said. Interesting he'd ride all the way out here in that storm. Said he was checking all the outlying homesteads. Ezra lied smoothly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got work to do. He made to close the door, but the scarred man's boot shot out, preventing it. One more thing, he said. Mr. Blackwood mentioned you might be personally interested in these fugitives. Said you had history with the woman. Ezra's blood ran cold, but he kept his expression neutral. Don't know what you're talking about. Sarah Morgan, the scarred man said, watching Ezra's face closely. Or she might be using her maiden name, Sarah Kendrick. Nursed during the war, wasn't she served with you in Virginia? The use of Sarah's maiden name confirmed Ezra's suspicions. These men had specific information, not just general descriptions. Blackwood had sent them here deliberately knowing or suspecting the connection. Never heard of her, Ezra said flatly. Now get your boot out of my door before I remove it for you. For a tense moment, the scarred man held his ground, his hand hovering near his own weapon. Then surprisingly, he withdrew his foot, stepping back with a mocking tip of his hat. Sorry to trouble you, Dr. Sullivan. We'll be on our way. But if you do happen to see anything unusual, Mr. Blackwood is staying at the Redemption Hotel. He'd be mighty interested in speaking with you directly. The emphasis on doctor made it clear they knew more about him than they should. Ezra watched impassively as they mounted and rode away, circling his property, rather than leaving directly, looking for signs of the fugitives, no doubt. Only when they had disappeared over the rise did Ezra close the door, his heart pounding. The encounter had gone better than he'd expected, but he had no illusions that they were convinced by his denials. They would be back, perhaps with Blackwood himself. He waited several minutes to ensure they were truly gone before opening the trap door. Caleb looked up at him, the pistol steady in his small hand, his other arm protectively around his sleeping mother. They're gone for now, Ezra told him, helping him climb out before carefully lifting Sarah. But they'll be back. Blackwood knows you're here, or at least suspects it. How quite? Caleb asked, his voice tight with fear. He knows your mother and I have history, Ezra explained, carrying Sarah back to the bedroom. It wouldn't be a huge leap to guess she might seek me out. What do we do now? Ezra laid Sarah gently on the bed, checking her pulse and temperature, still improved from the night before, thankfully. We need to leave, he decided aloud. As soon as your mother is strong enough to travel, Texas isn't safe for you anymore. Where would we go? Caleb asked, his young face creased with worry. Uncle James in San Antonio, Ezra nodded. That's probably best, but first we need to deal with Blackwood. Deal with him how? Ezra had been considering this question since learning the full story. That birth certificate is evidence of fraud. If we can get it to the authorities in St. Louis, Blackwood will be ruined, possibly imprisoned. He wouldn't be able to threaten you anymore. But how do we get it there, St. Louis is hundreds of miles away. I have a friend, Ezra said slowly, the plan forming as he spoke, a lawyer in Austin. He could help make sure the right people see these documents, that justice is done for Hannah. At the mention of his sister's name, Caleb's composure finally cracked. Tears welled in his eyes, spilling down his cheeks. She's never going to get her inheritance now, he said, his voice breaking. She's never going to know about any of it. Ezra placed a hand on the boy's thin shoulder. No, she won't. But you will. And your mother. And you can use it to build the life your father wanted for you. Caleb looked up, tears still streaming. It doesn't seem fair. Hannah was so good. She deserved more time. Yes, she did, Ezra agreed softly. Life isn't always fair, Caleb. Sometimes the best people are taken too soon, and the worst live on to cause more pain. It doesn't make sense, and it never will. Is that why you stopped being a doctor? Caleb asked. Because it wasn't fair that people died even when you tried to save them. The question was disarmingly perceptive. Partly, Ezra admitted. After my wife died, I couldn't see the point anymore. If I couldn't save her, what good was I to anyone? But you saved my mama, Caleb pointed out. And you might have saved Hannah too if we'd gotten here sooner. Maybe, Ezra said, though he knew pneumonia in children was often fatal regardless of treatment. The truth is, being a doctor means accepting that you can't save everyone. I forgot that for a while. Caleb considered this, his young face solemn. Pa used to say something like that about farming. Said you can do everything right and still lose a crop to hail or drought. But you plant again next season anyway. Ezra smiled slightly, struck by the simple wisdom. Your father sounds like he was a smart man. He was, Caleb said, his voice steadying, and he would have wanted me to be brave, to protect Mama. I think you've already proven how brave you are, Ezra told him. Not many grown men could have done what you did, getting your sister and mother to safety, finding help. A hint of pride flickered across Caleb's face, quickly replaced by determination. What do we do now about Blackwood's men? For now, we wait. Your mother needs at least another day or two to regain enough strength for travel. I'll keep watch, make sure we have warning if they return. Ezra spent the remainder of the day securing the house, checking locks, positioning furniture to provide cover if needed, making sure his weapons were readily accessible. He also packed supplies they would need for the journey to San Antonio: food, water, medicines, ammunition. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, each time more lucid than the last. By evening, she was able to sit up with help, to take broth and water, to speak clearly, if softly. Blackwood's men were here, Ezra told her as he changed her bandages. The wound looked better, still angry, but the worst of the infection was clearly subsiding. I heard, she admitted, from the cellar. You sent them away. For now, he said grimly. They'll be back probably with Blackwood himself. Sarah's eyes, though tired, were sharp with intelligence. You have a plan. The beginnings of one, Ezra confirmed. You and Caleb will go to your brother in San Antonio as soon as you're strong enough. I'll take Hannah's documentation to a lawyer friend in Austin, make sure Blackwood faces consequences for his fraud. And if Blackwood finds us before then, Ezra's jaw set. He won't. But Sarah knew him too well even after all these years. You're planning to confront him, she said, not a question but a statement. To use yourself as bait while Caleb and I escape. If necessary, Ezra admitted. It's too dangerous, Sarah protested. You know what Victor is capable of. He won't hesitate to kill you. I'm not exactly helpless, Ezra reminded her. And I have my own score to settle with Blackwood. He hesitated, then added, You told me last night about the medicine being switched, about seeing the hospital steward take Blackwood's bribe. Sarah's eyes widened. I didn't think you'd remember. I was so feverish. I remember, Ezra said quietly. Is it true? She nodded, her expression solemn. Yes, I tried to tell the inquiry, but they dismissed it as a woman's hysteria, a nurse being overly loyal to her doctor. There was no proof, just my word against the steward's, and he denied everything. Why would Blackwood do that, sabotage his own treatment? I've thought about that for years, Sarah said. My best guess is that he wanted an excuse for discharge for disability pension. The war was clearly turning against the Confederacy by then. Or maybe he just wanted someone to blame for his misfortune. She paused, studying Ezra's face. I should have tried harder to make you understand it wasn't your fault. I wouldn't have believed you, Ezra admitted. I was so certain I'd failed him, failed my oath. And now, Sarah asked softly. Ezra considered the question. Now, I don't know, the idea that I've spent years punishing myself for something that wasn't my mistake, it's hard to accept. It's easier to blame yourself than to accept that sometimes terrible things happen for no good reason, Sarah observed. That sometimes, no matter how skilled or dedicated you are, you can't save everyone. Her words echoed what he'd told Caleb earlier, and what Ruth had tried to tell him in those final days before her death. The symmetry was not lost on him. "Rest," he told her, adjusting her pillows. "We can talk more tomorrow." As darkness fell, Ezra took up position on the porch rifle across his knees, watching the road. Inside, Caleb had fallen asleep beside his mother's bed, finally overcome by exhaustion. The night was clear stars, pricking the vast Texas sky like countless pinpricks in black velvet. The air smelled of damp earth and sage, with the faint sweetness of wildflowers that had burst into bloom after the rain. It was a beautiful night, peaceful in a way that belied the danger he knew was coming. Ezra found himself thinking of Ruth, wondering what she would make of his current situation. She had always urged him to rejoin the world, to use his skills to help others again. Would she approve of his decision to protect Sarah and Caleb, even at the risk of his own life? He thought she would. Ruth had valued courage and compassion above all else. She would have taken in Hannah herself had she lived to meet her. She would have opened their home to Sarah and Caleb without hesitation. The sound of a horse approaching from the west pulled Ezra from his reflections. He raised his rifle, peering into the darkness. A single rider moving slowly, deliberately, not trying to conceal his approach. As the figure drew closer, Ezra recognized Sheriff Miller riding alone. The sheriff reined in at the edge of the yard, raising a hand in greeting. "Evening, Sullivan," he called. "Mind if I dismount?" "Be my guest," Ezra replied, keeping his rifle visible but not aimed directly at the lawman. Miller swung down from his horse, tying it to the hitching post before approaching the porch. "Sorry to disturb you so late," he said, removing his hat. "But I've got information you might find interesting." Ezra kept his expression neutral. "Blackwood's men were bragging in the saloon tonight," Miller said, "about finding the Morgan woman and her son. Said they were hiding out at a doctor's place east of town." Ezra's grip tightened on his rifle. "That's so." Miller nodded, his weathered face grim in the moonlight. "Thought you should know they're planning to ride out here at first light. Blackwood with them." "Why are you telling me this?" Ezra asked, suspicion clear in his voice. "Because when they came to my office to report finding fugitives, their story still didn't add up," Miller explained. "Said the woman murdered her husband and was running with stolen property. But I've been making inquiries. The Morgans were decent folks by all accounts, no history of trouble. And Blackwood? Different story altogether," Miller said. "Been asking around about him too. Man's got a reputation back east. Land swindles, fraud, intimidation. Nothing proven, but too many stories to ignore." Ezra considered the sheriff carefully. "So you believe the Morgans are the victims here, not the criminals?" "I believe there's more to the story than Blackwood's telling," Miller said diplomatically. "And I don't like men who think they can come into my jurisdiction and take the law into their own hands." "What are you suggesting?" Ezra asked. "That if you know where the Morgan woman and her boy are, it might be wise to get them somewhere safe before morning." Miller held up a hand as Ezra began to protest. "Don't tell me anything. I don't want to know. Just delivering a friendly warning, neighbor to neighbor." Ezra studied the sheriff's face, searching for any sign of deception, finding none. "Appreciate the warning," he said finally. "Neighbor to neighbor." Miller nodded, replacing his hat. "One more thing. Blackwood's been asking about you specifically. Seems you two have history." "You could say that," Ezra acknowledged. "Well, whatever it is, be careful. Man's got murder in his eyes when he says your name." With that, Miller turned and walked back to his horse. "Good night, Sullivan. Hope I don't see you in town anytime soon." As the sheriff rode away, Ezra remained on the porch, his mind racing. Miller's warning confirmed his worst fears. Blackwood was coming, and he knew Sarah and Caleb were here. They had until dawn to prepare. He returned inside, finding Sarah awake, her eyes questioning. "Blackwood's coming," he told her without preamble. "At first light. We need to move you and Caleb tonight." "Where?" she asked, pushing herself up on her elbows. "There's an old line shack about 3 miles west in a stand of cottonwoods," Ezra explained, already gathering supplies. "It's well hidden, rarely used. You'll be safe there while I deal with Blackwood." Ezra, no, Sarah protested. Come with us. We can all escape together. If we all disappear, he'll just keep hunting us, Ezra said. His decision made, this ends tomorrow one way or another. He gently woke Caleb, explaining the situation in terms the boy could understand. To his credit, Caleb asked no questions, simply began helping to gather their belongings. Within an hour, they were ready. Ezra had saddled Willow for Sarah, who was still weak, but able to ride with support. Caleb would ride double with her, helping to keep her steady. Follow the creek west, Ezra instructed as he helped Sarah into the saddle. The line shack is just beyond the big bend, tucked into the trees. Stay there until I come for you. And if you don't come, Sarah asked, her face pale in the moonlight. I'll come, Ezra promised. But if I'm not there by sunset tomorrow, ride on to Redemption. Find Sheriff Miller. Tell him everything. Caleb looked up at Ezra, his young face solemn. You're going to kill Blackwood, aren't you? Only if I have to, Ezra said honestly. I'm going to try to bring him to justice first. The boy nodded, accepting this answer. Thank you, he said simply. For everything. Ezra squeezed his shoulder. You're a brave young man, Caleb Morgan. Your father would be proud. He helped Caleb up behind Sarah, making sure they were both secure. Stay off the main trails, he reminded them. Keep to the creek where you can. It'll hide your tracks. Sarah reached down, grasping his hand. Be careful, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I can't lose anyone else. You won't, Ezra assured her, though they both knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. He watched them ride away, two silhouettes gradually swallowed by the darkness. Only when they had disappeared completely did he return to the house to prepare for Blackwood's arrival. As he cleaned his revolver and rifle, checked his ammunition, and laid out his plans for the confrontation to come, Ezra realized something surprising. He felt more alive than he had in years. The fog of guilt and self-recrimination that had enveloped him since Ruth's death had lifted, replaced by a clear sense of purpose. Tomorrow he would face Victor Blackwood and the ghosts of his past. He would protect Sarah and Caleb, ensure justice for Hannah, and perhaps finally find redemption for himself. With this resolve firmly in mind, Ezra Sullivan settled in to wait for dawn. Dawn broke across the eastern horizon, painting the Texas sky in streaks of crimson and gold. Ezra Sullivan stood on his porch watching the sunrise with the steady gaze of a man who had made peace with whatever the day might bring. His rifle rested against the railing, loaded and ready. His revolver hung at his hip, its familiar weight a reminder of darker days during the war. Inside the house, he had prepared carefully furniture positioned to provide cover, extra ammunition, placed strategically, escape routes planned. If Blackwood wanted a fight, Ezra would give him one. But that wasn't his preference. Justice, not vengeance, was what he sought. For Hannah, for the Morgans, and perhaps for himself as well. The distant sound of approaching horses reached his ears long before he could see the riders. Ezra remained where he was, outwardly calm, though his heart hammered against his ribs. He'd faced death before, both as a doctor fighting to save lives and as a soldier defending himself. But this confrontation felt different, more personal, more final somehow. 5 riders appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the rising sun. 4 were the typical rough men Blackwood favored, hired guns with no particular loyalty beyond their pay. But the 5th, riding slightly ahead of the others, was unmistakable, even at a distance. Victor Blackwood sat tall in the saddle despite his missing leg, his broad-shouldered frame cut sharp against the morning light. Even from afar, Ezra could make out the distinctive wide-brimmed black hat and the gleam of what he knew would be a silver-topped cane secured to his saddle, a gentleman's accessory that doubled as a concealed weapon. Ezra took a deep breath, steadying himself. 15 years had passed since their last encounter in that field hospital in Virginia. 15 years since Blackwood had pointed a finger at him and sworn revenge. 15 years of carrying the weight of a mistake that he now knew had never been his. The riders approached slowly, deliberately, no attempt at stealth or surprise. Blackwood clearly wanted Ezra to see him coming, to feel the anticipation, perhaps even fear. When they reached the edge of the yard, Blackwood raised a hand and the group halted. "Dr. Sullivan," he called, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "It's been a long time." "Not long enough, Blackwood," Ezra replied evenly. Blackwood laughed, a sound devoid of genuine humor. "Still bitter, I see. And here I thought you'd be pleased to receive an old patient." "You're not here for medical attention," Ezra said. "State your business and be on your way." "I think you know why I'm here." Blackwood's voice hardened. "The Morgan woman and her brat. My sources tell me they're in your care." "Your sources are mistaken." "Wow, are they?" Blackwood dismounted with practiced ease, despite his wooden leg reaching for his silver-topped cane. "Sheriff Miller seems to think otherwise, and my men reported signs of recent activity around your property. More than one person's worth." Ezra's jaw tightened at the mention of Miller. Had the sheriff's warning been a ploy meant to flush them out, or had Blackwood intimidated the information from him afterward? "The sheriff was here yesterday," Ezra confirmed, "asking about the Morgans. I told him the same thing I'm telling you. I haven't seen them." Blackwood began walking toward the porch, his cane leaving small indentations in the soft earth. His men remained mounted, hands near their weapons, watching. "You always were a poor liar, Sullivan," Blackwood said, stopping at the foot of the porch steps. "Even during the war, your face gave everything away. It's why I never trusted you with my leg." Ezra's hand instinctively moved closer to his revolver. "We both know what really happened with your leg, Blackwood. Sarah Morgan told me everything." A flicker of surprise crossed Blackwood's face, quickly replaced by cold calculation. "So she is here," he said. "Or was until recently. Where did you send them, Sullivan? The woman's half dead from infection, if my men's reports are accurate. She couldn't have gone far." "Far enough," Ezra replied. "They're beyond your reach now." Blackwood studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. "I don't think so. You wouldn't have stayed behind if they were truly safe. You're buying time." He turned to his men. "Search the property. Every building, every possible hiding place." Two of the riders dismounted, heading toward the barn, while a third began circling the house. "They're not here," Ezra said, picking up his rifle, not aiming it, but making its presence clear. "And you're trespassing." "Am I?" Blackwood smiled thinly. "I'd call it pursuing fugitives. The Morgan woman stole something valuable from me. I want it back." "You mean Hannah's birth certificate?" Ezra challenged. "Proof that you've been defrauding your own niece's estate for 8 years." Blackwood's smile vanished. "So she told you that fairy tale, did she? And you believed it, the woman's desperate Sullivan. She killed her husband and kidnapped that child. The birth certificate is a forgery." "We both know that's a lie," Ezra countered. "Mary Blackwood died giving birth to Hannah. Sarah and her husband adopted the child with your blessing until you discovered Hannah was entitled to an inheritance you had been stealing." Anger flashed in Blackwood's eyes. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't I?" "The lawyer's letter spells it out clearly. $20,000, Blackwood. That's what this is about. That's why James Morgan is dead, why Sarah was shot, why Hannah—" Ezra's voice caught. "Why Hannah died of pneumonia while fleeing your men." For the first time, genuine surprise registered on Blackwood's face. "The girl is dead." "Yes," Ezra confirmed grimly. "Fever took her 3 days ago. I buried her myself." Blackwood absorbed this information, his expression unreadable. Then unexpectedly, he laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Well, that simplifies matters. If the girl is dead, her claim dies with her. All I need now is that documentation and the 2 witnesses who know too much." "It's not that simple," Ezra said. "The birth certificate and lawyer's letter are already on their way to St. Louis, along with statements from Sarah and the boy about your role in James Morgan's murder." This was a bluff, but Ezra delivered it with conviction. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, assessing the claim. You're lying, he decided. There hasn't been time, which means you still have the documents, or the woman does. He tapped his cane thoughtfully against the ground. Either way, I'll find them. One of Blackwood's men emerged from the barn, shaking his head, no sign of Sarah or Caleb there. The man circling the house returned with a similar report. See, Ezra said, as I told you, they're not here. Then where are they? Blackwood demanded. Where would you send a wounded woman and a child in the middle of the night? Not to town, too obvious. Not to neighbors, you don't have any by choice. His eyes scanned the surrounding landscape, calculating. Somewhere close then, somewhere you know. Ezra kept his expression neutral, but his mind raced. Blackwood was too shrewd, too familiar with the logic of pursuit. If he started searching systematically, he might eventually find the line shack. Give it up, Blackwood, Ezra advised. Even if you find them, it's too late. Too many people know what you've done. Sheriff Miller is already suspicious. The lawyer in St. Louis is expecting communication. You can't silence everyone. Can I? Blackwood's smile returned cold and confident. You'd be surprised what money can accomplish, Sullivan, especially out here where law is flexible. Not this time, Ezra said firmly. This ends today. You can ride away, leave the Morgans alone, or you can face the consequences of your actions. Blackwood laughed again. You always did have an inflated sense of your own righteousness. Even after you butchered my leg, you believed you were blameless. We both know what really happened, Ezra repeated. Sarah saw your hospital steward switch my medicines. Your gangrene was already too advanced by the time you came to me, but you needed someone to blame, someone to hate. So you bribed the steward, made sure the treatment would fail, then accused me of negligence. The accusation hung in the air between them. Blackwood's men exchanged uncertain glances, clearly not privy to this history. An interesting theory, Blackwood said finally, but unprovable. The steward died at Cold Harbor, if you recall, and Nurse Morgan's testimony was dismissed as the hysterics of a woman too attached to her doctor. He leaned forward, his voice hardening. The fact remains, Sullivan, you took my leg, and now I'm going to take everything from you as I promised. He gestured to his men. Burn it, he ordered. Burn it all. The house, the barn, every structure. And when Sullivan tries to flee, shoot him. The men hesitated, looking at each other uncertainly. One of them, the scarred man who had led the previous day's visit, spoke up. Mr. Blackwood, we came to find the woman in the papers. Burning a man's home, shooting him in cold blood that's hanging a fence. Are you questioning me, Davies? Blackwood's voice was dangerously soft. The scarred man, Davies, stood his ground. I'm saying this isn't what we agreed to. Finding fugitives is one thing. Murder and arson is another. Blackwood's face darkened with fury. In one swift motion, and he drew he drew a small derringer from his coat pocket and fired. Davies crumpled to the ground, a bloom of red spreading across his chest. The remaining men froze, shock evident on their faces. Even Ezra, who had been prepared for violence, was taken aback by the coldness of the execution. Anyone else have concerns? Blackwood asked calmly, as if he'd merely swatted a fly. The men shook their heads, eyes wide with fear. Good, Blackwood said. Now, as I ordered, burn everything, kill Sullivan, then we'll find the woman and boy. As the men moved to obey, reaching for the oil lamps hanging from their saddles, Ezra made his decision. Raising his rifle in one fluid motion, he fired a warning shot over their heads. Next one won't miss, he promised, chambering another round. Get on your horses and ride away. This isn't your fight. The men hesitated, looking between Ezra's rifle and Blackwood's furious face. The calculation was clear in their expressions, one man with a rifle against three of them, but that one man had the high ground and cover of the porch. And their employer had just demonstrated how he treated men who failed him. $20 extra for each of you, Blackwood snapped, plus 10% of whatever we recover from the Morgan estate. Now do as I say. Greed overcame fear. The men drew their weapons, spreading out to make harder targets. One darted toward the barn, while another took cover behind the water trough. The third began circling toward the side of the house. Ezra cursed under his breath. He'd hoped to avoid bloodshed to find a peaceful resolution, but Blackwood had made that impossible. Taking careful aim, he fired at the man by the water trough, catching him in the shoulder. The man cried out, dropping his gun and falling backward. A bullet splintered the wood of the porch railing near Ezra's head, the man who had circled to the side of the house, firing from the corner. Ezra ducked, rolling to better cover behind a sturdy porch column. "You're outnumbered, Sullivan," Blackwood called, having retreated to the safety of his horse. "Surrender now. Tell us where the Morgans are and I might let you live." Ezra didn't bother responding. Instead, he waited for the man at the corner to fire again, then used the moment after to lean out and take his shot. His bullet found its mark. The man staggered, clutching his thigh, then collapsed. Two down, injured but alive. One still unaccounted for the one who had headed for the barn. And Blackwood himself, who remained mounted just beyond effective pistol range, watching the battle unfold with calculating eyes. A flicker of movement from the barn caught Ezra's attention. The third man had emerged with a burning torch, heading for the house. Ezra raised his rifle, but before he could fire, another shot rang out from an unexpected direction. The man with the torch jerked, then fell face forward, the flames sputtering out in the dirt. From the edge of the property, a lone rider appeared, rifle still raised. "That's far enough, Blackwood," Sheriff Miller's voice carried clearly across the yard. "Drop your weapon and surrender." Blackwood's head snapped toward the new threat, surprise quickly replaced by calculation. "Sheriff," he called back, "you're just in time. Sullivan here is harboring fugitives, and he's shot two of my men without provocation." "Funny," Miller replied, riding closer, his rifle still trained on Blackwood. "From where I was watching, looked like your men were about to commit arson after you shot one of your own in cold blood." Ezra felt a surge of relief. Miller hadn't betrayed them after all. The sheriff must have suspected Blackwood would make his move at dawn and had followed to observe. Blackwood's face contorted with rage. "You're making a serious mistake, Sheriff. I have influential friends in Austin and Washington. One word from me." "Your words don't carry much weight here," Miller interrupted. "Now drop that derringer before I put a hole through you." For a moment it seemed Blackwood might comply. His hand moved as if to release the small pistol. Then with startling speed he raised it and fired at Miller. The sheriff's horse reared as the bullet whistled past. Miller lost his balance, tumbling from the saddle as his rifle discharged harmlessly into the air. He hit the ground hard, momentarily stunned. Blackwood seized the opportunity, spurring his horse toward the fallen lawman, derringer raised for a killing shot. Ezra didn't hesitate. Stepping out from behind the column, he took careful aim and fired. The bullet struck Blackwood's arm, causing the derringer to fly from his grasp. His horse, startled by the gunshot and sudden movement, reared violently. With only one leg to grip with and his injured arm unable to grasp the saddle, Blackwood toppled backward, landing heavily on the ground. He lay there for a moment dazed, then began struggling to rise, reaching for his fallen cane. Ezra descended the porch steps, rifle aimed steadily at Blackwood's chest. "Stay down," he ordered. "It's over." Blackwood froze, looking up at Ezra with hatred burning in his eyes. "It's never over," he snarled. "Not between us." "Yes, it is," Ezra insisted. "Sheriff Miller heard your confession. He saw you shoot your own man. It's finished, Blackwood." Miller had regained his feet and was approaching cautiously, his own revolver now drawn. "He's right, Blackwood. You're under arrest for murder, attempted murder of an officer, and whatever else I can think of on the ride back to town." Blackwood's gaze never left Ezra's face. "You think this changes anything? You still took my leg. You still ruined my life." "No," Ezra said firmly. "You ruined your own life. With your greed, your cruelty, your need for someone to blame. I tried to save your leg, but you made sure I would fail. And when that wasn't enough, you murdered an innocent man and tried to kill his family, including your own niece. Something flickered in Blackwood's eyes, not remorse exactly, but perhaps the first glimmer of recognition that his carefully constructed justifications were crumbling. Hannah was Mary's daughter, he said, his voice oddly hollow. She looked just like her. Yes, she did, Ezra confirmed, and now she's gone along with any chance you had to make things right. Sheriff Miller had reached them, keeping his revolver trained on Blackwood while scanning the yard for any further threats. The two wounded men were still down, moaning, but alive. Davies lay motionless where he had fallen, clearly dead from Blackwood's bullet. "We need to get these men to a doctor," Miller said, then glanced at Ezra. "I suppose you're the closest thing we've got." Ezra nodded. "I'll do what I can for them." "And Blackwood?" Miller asked. "Flesh wound," Ezra assessed. "He'll live to stand trial." As Miller began securing Blackwood with handcuffs, a movement at the edge of the property caught Ezra's eye. Two riders approaching slowly from the west, one supporting the other. His heart sank. Sarah and Caleb. They must have heard the gunfire and returned despite his instructions to stay hidden. "Sarah," he muttered, already moving toward them. "Damn it, woman." Blackwood's head snapped up at the name, following Ezra's gaze. A cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he said. "Looks like I won't have to search for the Morgans after all. They've come to us." "Shut up," Miller ordered, yanking Blackwood roughly to his feet. "You've caused enough trouble." Ezra broke into a run, meeting Sarah and Caleb halfway across the field. Sarah looked pale and exhausted, barely able to stay upright in the saddle. Caleb sat behind her, his small arms supporting her, his face tight with worry. "You were supposed to stay hidden," Ezra admonished, helping Sarah down from the horse. "We heard shooting," she explained weakly. "Couldn't just wait, not knowing." "Mom insisted," Caleb added. "Said we couldn't let you face him alone." Despite his frustration, Ezra felt a warm surge of something that might have been affection. "Well, you missed the excitement," he said, trying to keep his tone light. "Blackwood's under arrest and his men are either dead or wounded." Relief washed over Sarah's face. "Thank God," she whispered. "Is it really over?" "Yes," Ezra assured her, supporting her weight as they walked back toward the house. Sheriff Miller witnessed everything. Blackwood confessed to ordering James's murder, and he shot one of his own men in cold blood. "He'll hang for this, Sarah." Caleb had dismounted and walked beside them, his young face solemn. "What about Hannah's money?" he asked. "Will it still come to us?" "I expect so," Ezra said. "Your mother is Hannah's legal guardian. The lawyer in St. Louis will help sort everything out." As they approached the yard, Blackwood's hateful gaze fixed on Sarah and Caleb. "You think this is justice?" he spat. "A murdering thief walking free while I'm arrested?" Sarah straightened, finding strength despite her weakness. "The only murderer here is you, Victor," she said clearly. "You killed my husband. Your actions killed Hannah. How many others have you destroyed for your greed?" Blackwood lunged against his restraints, causing Miller to jerk him back roughly. "You stole Mary's child," he shouted. "You had no right." "I saved her," Sarah corrected. "You would have let her die or worse. Mary knew that. It's why she begged me to take Hannah with her last breath." "Lies," Blackwood snarled, but there was uncertainty in his eyes now. "Mary wrote a letter," Sarah continued, "explaining everything. It's with Hannah's birth certificate and all the proof anyone will need of what really happened." Ezra watched Blackwood's face as the final thread of his self-justification unraveled. The man seemed to age before his eyes, his shoulders slumping, the fire in his gaze dimming to smoldering embers. "Get him out of here," Ezra told Miller. "Before I forget, I'm a doctor and do something I'll regret." Miller nodded, dragging the suddenly compliant Blackwood toward his horse. "I'll send a wagon for the wounded," he called over his shoulder. "Keep them alive if you can, Sullivan. They'll need to stand trial as accomplices." Ezra helped Sarah to the porch, settling her in a chair while he examined the two wounded men. As he'd suspected, neither injury was life-threatening. He cleaned and bandaged them as best he could, ignoring their sullen glares. Caleb watched the process with keen interest, handing Ezra supplies when asked, observing his techniques with the serious attention of a student. "You're good at helping," Ezra observed as they finished with the second man. "I used to help Mama when she treated the animals on our farm," Caleb explained. "She taught me lots of things." Ezra glanced at Sarah, who was resting with her eyes closed, some color having returned to her cheeks. "Your mother is a fine healer. She saved many lives during the war, including yours," Caleb said matter-of-factly. Ezra looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" "She told me stories sometimes, the boy explained, "about the war. Said once you got real sick with camp fever and everyone thought you would die. But she wouldn't give up, stayed with you day and night until the fever broke." Something stirred in Ezra's memory. Hazy images of Sarah's face hovering above him, cool cloths on his burning skin, her voice urging him to fight to live. He'd forgotten that episode, entirely buried it with so many other war memories. "I didn't know she'd told you that," he said quietly. Caleb shrugged. "She said you were the best doctor she ever knew. That's why she was sure you could save Hannah." His voice caught on his sister's name. Ezra placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I wish I could have." "I know," Caleb said with a wisdom beyond his years. "Like you said, sometimes we can't save everyone, but we keep trying anyway." The wagon Miller had promised arrived mid-morning, driven by a deputy who regarded the scene with wide eyes but asked no questions. The wounded men were loaded carefully along with Davies's body and taken back to town. Left alone at last, Ezra, Sarah and Caleb sat on the porch watching the dust settle on the road, the events of the morning, already taking on the quality of a dream or nightmare, hard to believe, but impossible to forget. "What happens now?" Caleb asked, breaking the silence. Ezra looked at Sarah, raising an eyebrow in question. It was her decision after all. "We still need to reach my brother in San Antonio," she said slowly. "At least temporarily until we decide what to do next." She hesitated, then added, "Unless, unless we have another option." The question in her eyes was clear. Ezra found himself at a crossroads he hadn't anticipated. 5 years of solitude had become comfortable, predictable. The idea of changing that, of opening his life to others again, was both terrifying and strangely appealing. "You're welcome to stay here," he offered cautiously, "while you recover, until you decide what's best for you and Caleb." It wasn't quite the response Sarah had been looking for. He could see that in the slight dimming of her eyes, but she nodded acceptance. "Thank you. That's very generous." Caleb looked between them, clearly sensing the undercurrents, but not fully understanding them. "I like it here," he announced. "It's peaceful, or it was until today." Despite everything, Ezra found himself smiling. "It usually is," he agreed, "though I'll admit it's been livelier since you two arrived." "Is that good or bad?" Caleb asked seriously. Ezra considered the question. The past few days had been chaotic, dangerous, exhausting. He'd performed surgery for the first time in years, confronted ghosts from his past, and engaged in a gunfight on his own property. Yet he'd also felt more alive, more purposeful than at any time since Ruth's death. "Good," he decided aloud. "Definitely good." The days that followed took on a rhythm that felt both novel and strangely familiar. Sarah's strength returned gradually, allowing her to move about the house, to sit in the sunshine on the porch, to help with small tasks. Caleb threw himself into ranch work with the enthusiasm of a boy who had found a new purpose, learning quickly and asking endless questions. Ezra found himself sharing knowledge he hadn't realized he still possessed: medical techniques, with Sarah ranching skills, with Caleb stories of the world beyond Texas, with both of them during evening meals that were no longer silent, solitary affairs. A week after Blackwood's arrest, Sheriff Miller rode out to inform them that the preliminary hearing had been held. Blackwood would stand trial for murder, with his surviving men testifying against him in exchange for reduced sentences. "The lawyer from St. Louis arrived yesterday," Miller added as he accepted a cup of coffee from Sarah. Seems Blackwood's been embezzling from the estate for years, just as you suspected. The funds that remain will be transferred to Mrs. Morgan as Hannah's legal guardian. And Victor, Sarah asked, her voice steady. Looking at hanging, Miller said bluntly. Unless his fancy lawyers can work a miracle. But with 3 witnesses to him shooting Davies, I wouldn't bet on it. After the sheriff left, Ezra found Sarah in Ruth's garden, kneeling among the newly sprouting vegetables despite her still healing shoulder. Her face was turned up to the sun eyes, closed tears tracking silently down her cheeks. Sarah, he said softly, not wanting to intrude on her grief. She didn't open her eyes, but she reached out a hand, which he took, kneeling beside her in the soft earth. It doesn't bring them back, she said quietly. James Hannah, knowing Victor will pay doesn't change that they're gone. No, Ezra agreed, nothing can change that. But it does mean we can stop running, she continued. Stop looking over our shoulders. We can start to build something new. The word we hung between them, laden with possibility. Ezra felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever he thought of moving forward, of leaving the past behind. But it was less painful now, less suffocating. What do you want to build, Sarah? He asked, genuinely curious. She opened her eyes, then meeting his gaze directly. A home, she said simply, for Caleb, for myself. A place where we can heal, where we can use our skills to help others. Here, the question escaped before Ezra could consider its implications. A small smile touched Sarah's lips. If we're welcome, this land has good bones, Ezra, like you, but it needs tending, nurturing. She gestured to the garden where Ruth's careful planning was still evident in the neat rows of emerging plants. It needs life. Ezra looked around at the ranch, the house that had been too quiet for too long, the fields that produced less than they could, because one man could only do so much, the medical supplies gathering dust when they could be helping people. I'm not sure I remember how, he admitted. To live fully, I mean. It's been so long. I can help you remember, Sarah offered, if you want. The question, unspoken but clear, hung in the air between them. Did he want to try again? To open himself to the possibility of joy, but also loss? To build something that could be taken away? The sound of laughter drew their attention to the corral, where Caleb was attempting to teach Buck's replacement, a gangly young collie, to herd chickens. The dog was more interested in chasing its own tail, sending Caleb into peals of helpless laughter. It was a sound Ezra hadn't heard on his property in years, children's laughter. It struck him like physical pain, but a cleansing sort, like the sting of antiseptic on a wound too long left untreated. Yes, he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. I want to try. Sarah's smile widened, genuine happiness lighting her face despite the tears still drying on her cheeks. Then we'll try together. 2 days later, they rode to Hannah's grave on the hillside behind the house. The spring wildflowers were in full bloom now, creating a carpet of color across the previously barren earth. Caleb carefully placed a fresh bouquet on the small mound, while Sarah knelt to straighten the wooden cross Ezra had crafted. I've been thinking, Caleb said, looking at the other graves nearby Ruth's and Buck's. Hannah would have liked it here. She always wanted to live somewhere with lots of flowers and animals. I think she would have too, Sarah agreed, her voice steady, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Maybe, Caleb continued hesitantly, maybe we could use some of Hannah's money to build a proper house for her. Not just the cross, but a little house like she always wanted to have for her dolls. Ezra exchanged a glance with Sarah, both touched by the boy's suggestion. I think that's a fine idea, he said. We could put it right here where she can always see the sunrise. Caleb nodded, satisfied. And maybe, he added, his voice taking on a note of hope that had been absent since Ezra first met him. Maybe someday there could be other children here. Not to replace Hannah, but so she wouldn't be lonely. The implication wasn't lost on either adult. Ezra felt heat rise in his face while Sarah busied herself adjusting flowers that needed no adjustment. Perhaps someday, she said carefully, not looking at Ezra. For now, though, we focus on healing and building what we can. Like the clinic, Caleb asked eagerly. This had been a topic of discussion over the past few days, the possibility of converting part of the barn into a small medical clinic where Ezra and Sarah could treat the scattered homesteaders and ranch hands of the area who currently had to travel nearly 30 miles to Redemption for medical care. Yes, like the clinic, Ezra confirmed, and expanding the herd, repairing the north fence line, and all the other projects we've talked about. It's a lot of work, Caleb observed. Yes, Ezra agreed, but good work, worthwhile. As they walked back to the house together, Ezra found himself thinking of Ruth, wondering what she would make of these developments. He could almost hear her laugh, see the approving sparkle in her eyes. She had always believed he would find his way back to the light eventually, had tried to tell him in those final days that life would continue, that joy could be found again. He hadn't believed her then, hadn't wanted to. But standing here now, watching Sarah and Caleb walk ahead of him, animated in discussion about the clinic plans, he thought perhaps she had been right after all. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, a comfortable silence fell between them. Caleb had gone to bed early, exhausted from a day spent helping Ezra repair the chicken coop. I've been thinking, Sarah said, finally her voice soft in the gathering dusk, about names. Ezra looked at her curiously. Names, she nodded, her gaze still on the horizon. If we're truly starting something new here, a clinic, a home, a family of sorts, perhaps it should have a name that reflects that. You mean rename the ranch? Ezra considered the idea. The property had never had a formal name, had simply been known as the Sullivan Place since he'd bought it. Yes, Sarah said, something that honors the past but looks to the future. Ezra thought about it, about the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. A desperate boy dragging his sister's body across the prairie, a woman fighting infection and betrayal, a man emerging from half a decade of self-imposed exile. About Hannah, whose short life had inadvertently been the catalyst for so much change. Prairie Song, he suggested quietly, in honor of Hannah's love of wildflowers and music. Sarah's eyes met his surprise and pleasure evident in her expression. That's beautiful, Ezra. Prairie Song Ranch. She tested the name, nodding approval. It feels right. It does, he agreed, surprised to find that he meant it. They fell silent again, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the eastern sky. The air was cool, but not cold, fragrant with sage and wildflowers. From somewhere in the distance came the lonesome call of a whippoorwill, echoed moments later by another. Ezra, Sarah said after a while, her voice hesitant, I want you to know that I don't expect, that is, I understand if you're not ready for. He turned to look at her, this woman who had re-entered his life so unexpectedly, bringing chaos and danger, but also purpose and hope. In the fading light, with her dark hair loose around her shoulders and her eyes reflecting the emerging stars, she was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. I'm not Ruth, she said, finally meeting his gaze directly. I will never try to be. I know, Ezra said softly, and I'm not James. No, she agreed, but perhaps that's all right. Perhaps we can be something new together, something built on understanding and shared purpose, rather than trying to replace what we've lost. Ezra considered her words, finding wisdom in them. What he felt for Sarah wasn't what he had felt for Ruth, that passionate, all-consuming love of youth. This was something different, a deeper understanding, that a recognition of shared pain and resilience, a quiet appreciation for her strength and compassion. I'd like that, he said simply. Sarah's smile was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. She reached across the space between their chairs, her hand finding his. Their fingers intertwined, a small connection, but a significant one, the first deliberate touch between them that wasn't about medical necessity or casual assistance. So would I, she said. 6 months later, and Sheriff Miller stood on that same porch, though much had changed since his last visit. The house had been repaired and expanded with fresh paint and new curtains in the windows. The barn had been converted, its eastern half now a tidy clinic where Ezra and Sarah treated a steady stream of patients from the surrounding area. New fencing enclosed larger pastures where cattle grazed, tended by hired hands, who lived in the bunkhouse Ezra and Caleb had built over the summer. But the most significant change was evident in the gathering assembled for the occasion, nearly 30 people from Redemption and the outlying homesteads, all there to witness the small ceremony Miller had ridden out to perform. By the authority vested in me by the state of Texas, the sheriff concluded, closing his small book. I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride, Dr. Sullivan. Ezra, uncomfortable in his rarely worn suit but unable to contain his smile, leaned forward to place a gentle kiss on Sarah's lips. The assembled guests cheered, none louder than Caleb, who stood proudly beside them, having served as both best man and ring bearer. As congratulations were offered and the celebration began, Ezra found a moment to slip away to the hillside where Ruth was buried. Sarah had encouraged this private farewell, understanding his need for closure. The small grave was well tended as always, with fresh wildflowers placed that morning. Beside it stood a miniature house lovingly crafted by Caleb for Hannah, a dollhouse for a child who would never play with it, but whose memory was honored daily in the life they were building. I think you'd approve, Ruth, Ezra said softly to the quiet grave. You always said I needed to rejoin the living someday. I just didn't expect it to happen quite like this. He smiled slightly. But then you always did say God had a sense of humor. The breeze stirred the prairie grass, sending ripples across the hillside like waves on a golden sea. In the distance, he could hear the yekos and laughter from the wedding celebration, the sounds of life continuing, evolving, finding new patterns. Thank you, he whispered, for teaching me how to love. I'll carry that lesson forward, I promise. As he turned to rejoin the celebration, to embrace his new wife and the boy who was now his son, in every way that mattered, Ezra Sullivan felt the last weight of his self-imposed exile lift from his shoulders. The past would always be with Aunt Ruth, the war, the mistakes and triumphs that had shaped him, but it no longer defined him or limited his future. Ezra, Sarah called from the bottom of the hill, Caleb beside her. Everyone's asking for you. Coming, he replied, making his way down the slope to where they waited. As they walked back to the house together, to the gathering of friends and neighbors, to the celebration of new beginnings, Ezra reflected on the strange, painful, wonderful journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with a desperate question from a grieving child and would continue with countless other questions, challenges, joys, and sorrows. But they would face them together as a family, forged not by blood, but by choice, by shared purpose, by love. And in that moment, with Sarah's hand in his and Caleb's excited chatter filling the air, Ezra knew with certainty that Prairie Song Ranch would never again be silent.